like to welcome you today to a special story which we're going to share to remember a special time in our history. As Harold Goddard says, the destiny of the world depends less on the battles won and lost as it does on the stories remembered and told and loved. And it's with that in mind today that we tell a special story about the role that Tennessee played in a most important part of our democracy. And this is how that story begins. It was June 4th of 1919, and to everyone's surprise, the US Congress had voted to approve what would be the women's suffrage amendment. They had been trying and trying ever since in 1848, the Seneca Falls, New York Convention of Women decided that the women's right to vote was absolutely foundational to all the changes that they hoped to make in the United States. And so starting in 1848, they demonstrated, they marched, they brought their posters, they were jailed, they were beaten, they were starved, they were force-fed, and through all those decades, they never gave up the fight. And surprisingly, one by one, the states started to ratify that amendment. But it would take 36 states, and 35 had ratified. And then it got down to the last state. And the problems were this: the 9 southern states absolutely stood against women's suffrage. And the main arguments they made against it were that if women got the vote, then soon blacks would have the vote. And black men and women would dominate the white society in the South. And in other words, they brought back all the abhorrent racist arguments that came through the Reconstruction. And so they were trying very hard to drive a wedge in our country. But what did the white pro-women suffragist leaders do? Women like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, well, they reached out to the black leaders of the suffrage movement. Women like Ida B. Wells and Juno Frankie Pierce. And those together, those leaders of black and white women, worked together to assure the vote for women. But after 9 southern states had blocked it and buried it, it became evident that Tennessee, little Tennessee, was the last best hope to get the 36th state, the last one needed to ratify in order for it to become a part of the US Board Amendments. And so the governor of Tennessee, who was pro-suffrage, called a special meeting of the legislature. And all the legislators were called back to Nashville. And not only the legislators, but hundreds of political activists, lobbyists, people who would try to persuade on one side or the other, flooded into Nashville with the hopes of effecting this vote. And these people had tried a lot of different arguments in the previous states. But adding to the racist arguments, they brought some other ones with them to Nashville. The big business interests were concerned that if women got the vote, they might use that vote to change the kind of working conditions that women and children had. Children at that time were working 12-hour days, and there was no young limit for how young they had to be to do it. So big business was worried that if women got the vote and there were protections for the labor force, this would cut into their bottom line. And there was a 101-year-old woman who was named Mrs. Crawford Milton, and she said, "Oh, the money they brought into Nashville to bribe those legislators, pockets full of money." She said, "There has been nothing like that that I have ever seen before." And I'm sure a lot of people felt that way. And she said they were getting all of our men that they could, pockets full of money. A second group that was very much against the women's suffrage amendment with the liquor lobby. They were afraid, even though it was during Prohibition, that because of the movement of the Women's Temperance Association, if women got the vote, they would shut down the liquor business in a way that it would not be able to recover from. And so they went downtown Nashville to a hotel called the Heritage Hotel. And they took a whole suite of rooms called, affectionately, I'm sure, the Jack Daniels Suite. And they lured in those legislators, all of whom, of course, were men, and offered them free alcohol any time of day or night, just so they would promise that they would vote against that women's suffrage amendment. Their idea was to coax them to vote against or incapacitate them so they couldn't vote for. And that was, again, what Mrs. Milton commented on. She said, they took our men and their votes too with their alcohol. Well, what could the women do? What could the leaders of the women's suffrage group do? Well, they buttonholed the male legislators. They followed them. They argued. They talked. They gave reasons. They gave them tracts. They even went and camped out at Grand Central Station down in Nashville, so no legislator could sneak out of town on a train to avoid his vote. They were right there, ready to ambush him. And so those days went and came down to the wire, the special session. And one of the men who was coming for that special session was a young man from a small town in Tennessee named Nyota. And his name was Harry Byrne. And he was on the train going to Nashville for this special session of the legislature. He was only 26 years old. His fellow legislators called him Baby Byrne. And he had a mentor named Herschel Candle, who was an established Republican legislator, wielded a great deal of power. And Mr. Candle said to Harry, now Harry, if you want to succeed in this legislature, you'll vote the way I tell you to vote. And in this case, it's an absolute no on women's suffrage. If you vote yes, your career in the Tennessee legislature is going to be very, very short. And Harry took everything seriously that Mr. Candle told him. And he went and took a red rose and pinned it on his lapel. A red rose signified that he had promised to vote against the women's suffrage amendment. When the women were successful in getting the legislature to vote for their women's suffrage amendment, they would pin that legislator with a yellow rose. And so you would see on the lapels of the legislators a red or a yellow rose, and if they had neither, they were still open to persuasion. It was called later the War of the Roses, and war was not an exaggerated term. As a matter of fact, the governor of the state had to call on the National Guard to protect some of the leaders of the pro-suffrage movement because they had received death threats and threats of kidnapping. And so it all came down to one fateful day in August 18th, on the floor of the legislature in Nashville, Tennessee. Harry was there. Most of the legislators were there. It was Harry's earnest desire that he would not have to vote against women's suffrage, that it would actually be tabled before the vote would come up. And tabling the issue would have been a way to destroy it without voting on it. That's what Harry hoped he would have to do, not to vote against it. And that's why he had his red rose. So the day came, and as it sometimes happens in August in the state of Tennessee, it was sweltering. It was hot. There were no air conditioners then on the floor of the legislature. And the legislators were on the main floor with their desks in front of them, and the gallery was packed with women, with all of them different colored roses pinned to them. They were jammed into the balcony, leaning over to see who was going to do what. They were packed in like sardines. And so, finally, the issue came to the floor, and the motion was made to table the women's suffrage amendment. That amendment being that the right to vote in the United States should not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's what they were voting on. And what happened was, immediately after it had been brought on the floor, there was a movement to table it. And they had to have a vote on that movement. And so the roll call came down. And it was aye, nay, nay. And when it got right down to the end, the count was 46 aye and 46 nay. It was a tie vote. Oh, the tensions, which were high before, went even higher. And they tried again. Once more, they moved that the amendment would be tabled. And once more, they had a roll call vote. Aye, nay, but it was to no avail. The count on the vote was identical. It was a tie. And so it came down to bringing it onto the floor of the legislature, because until they would have to actually vote on it, they had no recourse. And so once more, the man called the roll. Aye, nay, aye. But when he got down to Harry Byrne slowly took his rose off, put it down on his desk, and said, aye. And time stood still. There were screams, there was yelling, there were throwing of flowers all over the legislature. There were people, cursing all over the place, knocking things, throwing things. It was total chaos and pandemonium. And they looked around for Harry Byrne. And he was nowhere to be found. Because after Harry had voted, he went behind him and climbed out a window and crawled across a narrow metal ledge and into the window of the attic of the Tennessee State Library, which was next door. He went in and he went to a room in the attic that was quiet. He told himself he was waiting for things to settle down in the legislative floor. And he sat on the floor and he leaned against the wall and he reached inside his jacket pocket and he pulled out a letter. And this letter, he opened it up, and it was almost like he could hear his mother's voice. She wrote, Harry. And she told him the news from home, the casual news about weddings and weather and how the farm was doing. Now, Feb Byrne, Harry's mother, was a special woman. She ran the farm by herself. She was a widow. But more than that, she had a college education, and she read 3 newspapers a day, and she had been following the women's suffrage movement every single day. But she could not find out, even from careful readings, what way Harry's vote was going to go. So after thinking about it, she decided that she might need to give him what she called a gentle nudge. And so she sat down at her kitchen table and penned about 5 pages of letter. It was lighthearted. It was cheerful. And at the very end, almost as if it were by accident, she wrote, Oh, Harry, hurrah for women's suffrage, and you vote for it. And don't make them wait to see what way you're going to go. And then, as if to have a special joke with her son, she said, and maybe, just maybe, you can help Mrs. Catt, C-A-T-T, with her rat problem, meaning ratification. And Harry smiled. And he thought about the vote he had done. Well, the governor of the state immediately assigned a bodyguard to him because his life was not safe. But instead of accepting it, Harry asked to address the entire assembly the next day. And as he stood up there with the podium in front of all the legislators, all of whom were much older than he was, he explained to them that as far as he was concerned, to vote for women to be allowed to vote was a moral issue. And he believed that they had the moral right to vote. He said, I believed it yesterday, and I believe it today. And so that was how Tennessee broke the tie, became the 36th state, ratify the 19th Amendment, which resulted in it being placed in the Constitution and the Bill of Amendments. So then what happened was this. Some people do not necessarily accept the results of an election. Voting doesn't always end it. And this also happened for this particular election. The governor of Louisiana was totally upset that it had come down to one green boy's vote. So he sent his wife to Feb, which, by the way, Feb Byrne, the mother, Feb is a nickname for Phoebe. So he sent his wife to talk to Feb about telling her to change her son's vote, to tell him to come back home and to change his vote, to vote against women's suffrage. And so, uninvited, the wife of the Louisiana governor visited Feb Byrne at her farm in Nyota, Tennessee, and talked to her and explained all the reasons that she thought she had why Feb should talk her son Harry into changing his vote. When she finished, Feb said, actually, I think that Harry did the right thing. I'm proud of him. I'm glad he did it. And I wouldn't ask him to change it for anything. This did not make the wife of the governor happy, but there was nothing she could do. And so this is an example of how one person's vote, and there was one more part of this that needs to be said. That October, for the first time ever, women could register to vote. And who was the first one in line? That would be Feb Byrne. She was #1 registration. And the paper that she filled out and signed said that this gave permission for the man to be able to vote in the election. And they said to her, well, it doesn't, I mean, you're not a man. And the woman next to her said, I know, they didn't have time to change it before the election. And she said, besides that, it's a new world now. And indeed it was. And so Feb cast her first vote at the age of 57. So proud of her son. And if you go to Nashville today, you will see a lovely statue of Feb Byrne and her son Harry, who did such a wonderful act of courage, and it was what made all the difference. So I would agree with Harold Goddard that you can tell the destiny of the world, not by the battles won and lost, but by the stories that are loved and retold.